That's an entrance.
There we go.
Hi guys, sorry.
Hiya, how you doing?
Pretty well, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Good to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
It feels weird not to see you kind of like, I had the impression before that you were kind of squeezed on a camper bed with headphones on.
Yeah, that's true. I was sequestered to the bedroom, basically. Yeah. Now I've got the office, so I've been upgraded tonight.
Oh, brilliant. How are you getting on generally?
Yeah, pretty good.
If you don't mind me saying, you look like you put a little bit of weight on.
Put a little bit of weight on.
Is that because you stayed indoors?
Yeah.
Simon's not used to what I like to call, even though he's as English as Queen Victoria's underwear, I have a certain candor about me, which he doesn't appreciate. I like to call it honesty. But I think it's because I'm assuming, the last time we spoke, we had about 12 minutes of freedom since then, and we've all just been locked in. And yeah. How are you getting on with it?
Well, actually, so the thing is, I put on weight and then took it back off. So I apparently haven't taken it all back off yet. I put on a lot over Christmas.
I'm just joking. Listen, I weigh 17 and a half stone. I'm in no position to be telling anybody.
No, I'm not being sensitive about it. But it's just interesting because I know like how much I weighed when I talked to you guys last.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely heavier. But because I was much heavier, in my mind, I'm like, I suppose I am heavier than when I saw.
Oh, really? I thought you had the whole emaciated look of a philosopher, to be honest. I think
last time. Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Can I be honest with you? I'm going to go slightly off piece because we're going to come back to the boring stuff and Simon will talk in a minute. But one of the things I've been mostly missing about lockdown is my travels. And if I'm being honest, I have a strange divorced estranged relationship with America, because before lockdown, like about 16 months before that, I traveled from the East Coast to the West Coast. And now what I do is about every fourth day, my wife will walk into the front room and I'll go, "Do you remember Austin?" And she and she says, yeah, I remember. And we'll talk about the smallest thing ever, like going to a yoga studio in the middle of Austin. And I really miss America, so that's where I'm at with it.
Yeah, it's the same for us. We used to travel a lot, especially because right before the lockdown, I lived in Amsterdam, Alice lived in London, and so we were always going back and forth between those two. She traveled a lot for work, and I tagged along and traveled enough on my own. So we were kind of happy when we moved to Leamington Spa to kind of be together and to slow things down a little bit. And then the pandemic hit. And at the beginning, it was like, actually, this is great. We can kind of catch our breaths. And then like a month later, we kind of look around. We're like, okay, maybe a little bit more.
Throat. Yeah.
And now we're going crazy because we miss the traveling too.
Have you planned for when lockdown finishes? You got
not plans? Really. The interesting thing is because we're Americans, we're allowed to go back to the US. And so we will probably go late spring, early summer to visit our families. Our families have been vaccinated and they'll be in the US. So Alice is she has dual citizenship. So she's also British. So then she, on that passport, can come back here. Immigrants. I might have a little bit of a hard time getting back.
Whereabouts are you going back to America?
Well, her parents and her family are in Chicago, and I'm from Nebraska. So we'll go to both places. Yeah.
Cool.
So that'll be nice. My hope is to go to Scotland. I like to do backpacking and some climbing and stuff. So that's what I'm doing.
Have you been to Scotland before?
Yeah. I went last time between the lockdowns, and it was great. And I hadn't been before that too, but that was my first time.
Stu, why don't you tell Ben how you're actually Scottish? Because you don't talk about that an awful lot.
I spend most of my working hours talking about being Scottish. My dad's from the fair city of Edinburgh, and when I was in a band before I was a useful member of society, I toured Scotland several times, and I love it. And every time I drive into Edinburgh via the Ring Road, I feel like I'm driving home. I say that at least twice a day.
Yeah. I'm so, Americans have this habit of saying, like, if they have some Irish or Italian ancestry, they say, it's ridiculous. but my ancestry is Scottish.
Yeah.
So,
I noticed the kinship between you and me almost immediately.
Exactly. It's coming through. And when I was a kid, when I was like 17, my family lived here for a year, and my parents had good friends that lived in Aberdeen. So we spent quite a bit of time up there.
I'm sorry about that.
Well.
I mean, that's not a...
Yeah, we were there in the summer, and they do quite a bit to try to make up for the stone in the summer. And so that was okay. But then we went back like anytime outside of the middle of summer, basically. And it was like, oof, this is grim. It's still like the architecture is still pretty, but it's just gray from the grass to the sky. I mean,
yeah, you're right. Brilliant. Lovely to catch up with you. You all right, Si? How's it going?
Yeah, no, I'm fine. I was actually reflecting on both of your stories of travel back and forth, and I was empathising in a lot of ways. My wife, every fourth day, I look to my wife and I say, "Do you remember Bridlington? Remember Scarborough?"
See, I think a major point of contention. We have a lot in our relationship, me and Si, or as I like to call it, marriage. We have a lot of points of contention. One of them is travel. Now, when I grew up, when everyone went to university in the early 2000s, when I did, it was like such an intellectual faux pas to say you traveled, because you were basically just a cretin, an absolute cretin. You went to Vietnam for 6 months, claimed you were doing something, found yourself, you came back, and then went to work at a bank or whatever.
Yeah.
But I kind of discovered traveling later on in life, as in like global traveling. Like, you know, I've spent a summer in Japan, I've spent a summer in America, been around a lot of Europe and stuff. But Simon's similar to like kind of a life form that you find congealing in a gutter somewhere. Like he doesn't like anything outside of his street. It's peculiar, and I keep saying to him that he should travel. And one day, when he's old and grey, I'll drag him to, you know, a lovely beach in Spain, and he'll kind of grimace, you know, and go, yeah, I suppose it's all right or whatever. But he doesn't philosophically, how do you feel philosophically, how do you feel about travel, Benjamin?
I mean, I think it depends on your taste for novelty, probably. That's what I like about travel.
Don't play to him.
No, but well, I mean, that's what I like about it. So for me, I like things that are exotic and different and new. You know, this is a weird thing to say, but when I was a kid, one of my favorite things to do was to go to the grocery store and to see all the different kinds of breakfast cereal that I could have that we didn't normally buy.
Simon still does that.
But there are people who want to only eat the same breakfast cereal every day. And to them, that kind of choice and that novelty is like, why would you want that? And it can even be overwhelming, right? Yeah. And I think if you have that attitude more generally, more broadly in your life, then travel is not going to be exciting, and it's just going to be stressful. And I think even people who really like novelty still like to kind of cozy up at home and still have some kind of a home base. For me, I enjoy traveling more when I feel like I have somewhere settled to come back to. So I didn't enjoy traveling as much when I was a student because everything is in flux.
Yeah, kind of transitive. Yeah.
And for me, that's too much kind of movement in my life.
And being a student's a novelty anyway, in a way.
Exactly. There's a lot of new experiences in that case. So sometimes you just want the familiar.
And, you know, but the thing is, the thing that strikes me is there's an awful lot of mundanity around traveling. And then all of a sudden you find yourself up a mountain in Osaka and, you know, for want of a better phrase, like, I feel touched. And it touches something inside of me. Sorry. I'm laughing at my own jokes here. It does something to me, and then I'm forever like 0.0001% different, forever.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of on a journey to be 1% different in everything that I see. Simon, I'm well aware that we're kind of talking about you, not to you. But there's something like I respect you very much, but there's something British about not wanting to travel. And there's something American about not wanting to travel as well. Because Simon, one thing you always say to me is how few Americans have passports.
Yeah, that's true. That's one of my regular phrases when you're talking about and it's interesting actually. I think Ben sort of hit the nail on the head there. I have a favorite meal that I have if I'm celebrating something, and it's old El Paso fajitas. And I make them exactly the same way, with exactly the same ingredients in exactly the same portions. because I know through trial and error, so through some level of novelty, but I know that is the pinnacle for me of culinary delight. And I'm gutted that it is. And I've eaten this. This will surprise you. I've eaten in Michelin star restaurants.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. What surprises me is that A, you'd pay for that, and B, like what a wasted experience that is.
Yeah, restaurants I describe as big plate, little food, which tells you of my palate. Anyway.
It's like actually, living with Schrodinger's cat. You are like, it's unbelievable.
But actually, this is the thing as well. It's like my favourite place on planet Earth is Knaresborough in Yorkshire. I think it's beautiful, and there's something about it which is absolutely stunning. Which to use your wonderful phraseology, touches me. And actually, even when I'm there, there's a sense of there's that sense of base, there's that sense of home, there's that sense of, because I'm a Yorkshireman. There's the Yorkshire phrase that we have as well, that we like what we know and we know what we like. Maybe that's again a bit reductive. I was interested actually, Ben, when you were talking about actually enjoying travel when you know you've got a home base. I was actually thinking in terms of football, and not to shoehorn this in, but
that's a beautiful segue.
My mind
lovely stuff.
Is the difference between league games and like tournament games.
Yeah.
And the teams where the fans are like, oh, let's really go for it, and let's have our team go for it in the tournament. Let's get ourselves a trophy. Generally the teams that are safe where they are, they're not in danger of like trying to win the league. They're not in danger of being relegated. And so almost like they've got this like safety of home.
Yeah.
But actually, maybe with that, there is that sense of mundanity of like, oh, will we be 8th or will we be 7th? You're not talking about being first or last. And so it's like, whoa, let's almost travel. Let's have a bit of fun with the League Cup. Let's have a bit of fun with the FA Cup and that sort of thing. It's because there's that sense. I think, from my personal perspective, bringing it back to travel, I just love home. I think my novelty comes to what can I bring in to what's here. And I guess maybe as a football fan for Leeds United, particularly our team, we've never been that safe, have we? So we go out, we crash out of pretty much every tournament within the third round, which is quite low down. Yeah. But we're all like, oh, that's great, that's brilliant. We don't have to worry about it.
I mean, the tournaments are a way of raising the stakes, right? When there aren't really stakes to play for. If you're gonna fall in the middle of the table, then at a certain point the matches don't even. I mean, they matter to you because as a supporter you're watching that match, but they don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, because if you're finishing 7th or 8th or 10th or 5th, even in that range, it just doesn't. It's not a huge difference, basically. No one remembers. People remember who get relegated. It's pretty easy to remember that. They're playing in a different league. People remember who wins because they won, or who almost won, or who was in a position to win but then messed it up. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, right? But, all the way down to from 5 to the people who are in danger of being relegated, people don't really remember unless they're the kind of people who remember how their clubs finished every year, that kind of a person, but they don't remember for other reasons why they finished where they did.
Do you think that sort of links to sort of you mentioned about stakes, but I also think time plays a bit of a factor in this as well. And I think philosophically, this is an interesting sort of thing to think about for me as a football fan, because ultimately it's all meaningless. Ultimately, I've actually got nothing to do with it. But actually, when I think about the link between holidays and traveling,
this is brilliant. This is absolutely brilliant.
What you're thinking of is like, you want to maximize every single second, don't you? Because actually, you're not, Stu, you weren't going to be living. When you tell me about the food that you were eating in some backwater in the deep south of America, that sort of blew your mind.
Yeah.
It must have blown your mind in some ways, because there's a very real possibility that you'll never ever go back there and eat that food again. And so in that precise moment at that time, there is a very unique sort of temporal sort of moment and experience that actually you want to hold on to, but at the same time it's going to be fleeting. I think of tournament football. that brings that sense of actually you've got this one game that if you lose this game, you're out. The stakes are much higher. It's this one time major thing. You know, if every round that you get to that takes you that little bit closer to the summit, there's that sense of almost being on that trip or being on that travel, because it's like, well, this could be taken away and will be taken away in relative moments. That actually you don't get the sense of that with the league. You don't get the sense of that with home. Maybe I don't know if that's something that's sort of worth pondering.
Well, I mean, in league play, you can always make up, well, not always, but you can often, especially early in the season, you can make up for a loss, right? So if it's a single elimination tournament, I mean, you can't make that up. Every match matters. Towards the end of league play, every match matters, or no match matters. I mean, if there's nothing that you can do to the worst case scenario, you're 11th, best case scenario, you're 8th, then it doesn't matter, right? And so at that point, especially late in the season, for some teams, these matches are as exciting as tournament play. For other teams, nothing is going on in these matches. And so tournament play becomes an exciting alternative where the matches suddenly have much higher stakes, right? And for the teams who already have high stakes because they're at the top or the bottom, tournament play feels like a distraction, right? Because you feel you think that the players should be concentrating on league play. As a supporter, you feel like you need to concentrate your positive energy to league play to help avoid relegation or to help them win, right? So that's probably part of where it's coming from as well.
My feeling, I have a slightly different point of view. I kind of feel like there's a kind of vitality to something that that your tiny little life doesn't even touch. And so when we were going through America and stuff, and it doesn't have to be New York or LA or anything like that. It can just be like, again, like regular life. But I feel like there's this kind of like streak of like vitality of life. And I'm very far away from it now because I'm sat in a study in a know-nothing place in the middle of a dull country. But it's almost like you touch something, you get close to something, and then you're kind of in the middle of it. And like I had that sensation in so many places in America, and not just because of the glitz and the glamour, but like this sense that you're part of something vital, and then you kind of move back out of it again. And so you go towards this orb of like energy, and it's incredible. And you know it's about time. It's about this really small time, and I'm like, I've got to suck this all in, whether it's culture, whether it's experience, whether it's other people. I've got to experience as much as possible because I know I'm going to fade away from it. And so that for me is what travel is. And I guess if we're making the tenuous link towards tournament football, then I think that's the same thing, isn't it? Because you're this middle of the road club. No, even like your big clubs don't celebrate really winning pissy cups. They don't. No, they don't care. They couldn't care less. They put their second team out for the vast majority of the tournament. And if they get through, it's like whatever. But your first division team, it's their chance to come near that kind of orb of energy and be a part of that spotlight and feel something different and spectacular, and possibly even a chance for them to stand out and be noticed. And then they disappear back to the crap that they're kind of like dealing with on a day-to-day basis until they get that opportunity to come close to it again. So it is about time. I don't want to keep pushing the travel thing because it's not what we're here to talk about. Okay, so Ben, listen, since the last time we spoke to you, we've been in tumult, I think you could say. I think it's we've been thrown and cast asunder by the footballing gods. We've had great times, we've had not so great times, but all of the things we spoke to you about before have kind of really like bubbled to the surface. We spoke to you a little bit before about justice in football. We spoke to you about fairness, all these kind of abstract concepts. We spoke to you about VAR, and I think what we want to do is kind of almost do like a refresher on those things and kind of say, right, I'm not sure how much football you watch. I'm almost positive it's nothing. But you are an honorary Leeds United fan. But we won't talk just about Leeds United. We'll talk about football as a rule. There's a bit of a albatross around the throat of football at the minute, which is VAR. What are you drinking, by the way? Because that looks glamorous.
This is a Manhattan.
Can I come in with mine? Mine was
dirty
the
beaker of soiled water versus.
I can tell you what, it was genuinely, after that Manhattan, it was a Vimto 0.
Yeah, so the big talking point in football at the minute, it has been for the best part of the, since the season kicked off, has been VAR. Simon, what does VAR stand for?
Video assistant referee.
Perfect. You learn something new every day. And so what's happened is that there's been a general discussion and a general falling out about what constitutes offside, and what constitutes a timely interaction with the rules of the game to allow that to occur. So let me just give you a couple of examples. They've now grown attuned to drawing graphs of people's body movements as they happen. So a goal will be scored, and then they take a still frame from that moment, and they will literally draw a line across the pitch and up to people's kind of limbs to say, that is quite clearly offside. Here is the onside and here is the offside, which has obviously given birth to a whole bunch of conversation about, if your elbow is offside, then is that offside at all, because you can't score with your elbow. So even if you're flailing your arm like this in an offside position, it shouldn't really matter, because that part of, if the ball hits you on that part of your body, then it goes against the rules anyway. The other thing as well is they've ever so slightly adapted the offside rule so that they keep on playing for a certain amount of time and they don't raise the flag immediately to call offside. And that has resulted in some really unfortunate things happening, people being very, very badly hurt. Because they just carried the play. A good example was last night. There was 2 teams playing, and they carried on, even though it's offside, and they were going to pull it back. They carried the play on because their rationale is, well, if the team attacking gives the ball away, then it falls back onto the advantage of the team that might want to advance, and they don't have to blow the whistle. The play just kind of carries on.
Also, as well, it removes the human element from it, and I think this is
absolutely
quite interesting to look at. So they play it on just in case they've made a mistake.
And
absolutely. Then the VAR can swoop in.
So last night, 2 teams were playing and they didn't put the flag up for offside. And as a result, a defender ran into his own goalkeeper, which has ended up with, I think, a partial fractured skull type thing. And it's really bad. So machinery and rules and humans and also the players now are starting to react to all of those things as well. And there's a sensation that they're starting almost to be coached in how to manipulate and do those things. So Simon, in his usual insightful and erudite manner, is going to now pose a couple of questions to you about that philosophically.
Yeah. So I guess with that as the context, my feeling is with VAR I think the first question is VAR actually a neutral concept? And would you see it philosophically as a neutral concept? And actually the pressure lays upon the rule makers to make rules that are now adapted to this new VAR reality that we have. And the second question really is, morally speaking, is there anything wrong with coaching players to follow the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law?
Right. So I think that these two things go together. The first thing that comes to mind when you talk about the complications that VAR is introducing into the game and into kind of how play flows is Wittgenstein, actually. And so Wittgenstein has kind of 2 phases. There's early Wittgenstein and there's later Wittgenstein. He's kind of broken up into these 2 parts. And early Wittgenstein was interested in how language fits with the world and how we kind of can logically understand how language works. And it was very precise and very analytic. I mean, this is kind of the beginning of analytic philosophy. And he thought that in the Tractatus, which was his first work, that he'd solved all the problems of philosophy. Then he went away, didn't do philosophy for a while, and then he came back. And probably after talking to someone called Frank Ramsey, but other philosophers as well, he began to be dissatisfied with his early work. And so he had the Philosophical Investigations, which is his later work, a book that covers his later work, and that's later Wittgenstein. And both of these made huge contributions to philosophy. Wittgenstein is ranked with Kant and Hume and Aristotle and Plato and all of the great philosophers, except for he's almost contemporary for us. I mean, he's a 20th century philosopher. So that's the background. One of the things that Wittgenstein says in his later work is a repudiation of the kind of precision that you find in his early work. And there he's concerned with what it means to follow a rule and how rule following is supposed to work. And without going into too much detail, he's concerned that we can't ever fully specify all the rules of a game. So we can try to be more and more precise, but that's really it's never going to be possible to specify all the rules up front. And so that's one of the issues here, right? Is that we used to have an intuitive and rough idea of how offsides worked, but now, because we have more precise measurement tools, we want to have a more precise notion of offsides. And so we're precisifying it. But of course, this is raising other complications for how precisely we really want to set the parameters here, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's the first thing that comes to mind. Now, another practical issue has to do with how this interrupts the flow of play, right? So one thing that you hear when people talk about football proper compared to American football is that football is a beautiful game because it flows nicely. I mean, not only because, but partially because it flows nicely. And you have people, I mean, when the ball goes out of play, for example, then there's no like stopping, adjusting, officials coming up. The other team just grabs the ball, throws it in, and goes. Of course,
American sport will never be described as beautiful. It can't be because you don't play it for more than 10 seconds at a time. So yeah, you need a period of time, and as a result, you need mistakes, and you need genius, you need excellence, and that needs time.
That's right. I mean, I think the closest American sport comes, at least the main sport, is probably basketball. I think because you can get some nice plays there. But there's something about basketball. Basketball is actually, in many ways, similar to football, right? I mean, so you're trying to get the ball. It's the same kind of a thing into some kind of a goal at the end of either side. After you score, the other team immediately takes the ball back out and moves on. There's quite a bit of a flow in basketball, not as much as football for sure, right? But that's as close as it comes. And I think basketball is more beautiful because of that. And the least beautiful American game might be baseball because it's very slow.
Yeah.
And the pitches are very kind of punctuated. Every pitch, stop, throw it back, try again. Anyway, this is a digression. But that the effect on the aesthetics of the game, I think, is an important issue, right? So there's the playing on because might be a mistake and maybe they needed to continue playing. That's some rationale, but I suspect that part of the reason they allowed them to play on is so that people won't feel this interruption, which is aesthetically unappealing in football.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last thing that you mentioned is the strategizing in response to this, right? So teams are now becoming more sophisticated. They're now developing strategies for dealing with these new or more precise rules around offsides. And I think that that's natural. Of course, you're going to look for any kind of competitive advantage that you can, especially when it's, highly professionalized and very elite play. I mean, this is what you get out of kind of data analytics and all of these kinds of things in professional sports now, is that any edge that the team can get can be incredibly lucrative. And if they can come up with strategies around this change to the game that other teams haven't thought of yet, they're going to have a competitive advantage. So certainly I see why they do it. But I'm not sure, and I'm not sure that they're at fault for doing it, I would say. I think that we should allow the game to be a little bit sloppy. We could allow for this kind of human element. But so I think that when the introduction of technology makes the game worse and doesn't aesthetically and in terms of our enjoyment of watching it, and it doesn't clearly increase the fairness of the playing field, because some teams are now able to exploit new strategies around this VAR software or the introduction of VAR. I don't see what the gain is because it's not leveling the playing field necessarily. And yet it's leading to a decrease in the aesthetic enjoyment of the game. I'm not opposed to technology, full stop. So if you have technology that is measuring whether or not a goal was actually scored, right? So sensors around the goal, I don't really see that interrupting the game. It is a more precise way of ruling whether or not a goal was scored in a way, but it doesn't interrupt the flow of the
No,
play.
and we've had that for a while. What happens is the referees have this like buzzer on their belt, and if the ball crosses the line, it buzzes. But there have been mistakes with that. Actually.
What's really interesting about that is that technology has been around well before VAR and has been relatively uncontroversial. But the lack of the controversial element of it has meant that the single mistake that it has made blew up massively. So it made a single mistake, and the consequences.
And it was actually a really important mistake as well, because it was at the tail end of last season, and a team needed to score in order to stay out the relegation zone, and there was clear photographic evidence that Simon, remind me, the ball didn't cross the line, did it?
No, it didn't.
It didn't cross the line at all. Clear photographic evidence to show that half the ball was not over the line. But the referee did it, and there was some lame excuse afterwards that I know he's had his missus vibrator in his pocket or something. I don't know.
But actually, like, the interesting thing with that was Simon
doesn't like references to sex.
It's not that at all. It was actually that was a 110 million pound mistake. Because one club over the next 3 years would have lost out on that amount of money. And that carries. That
never made a mistake other than that.
Both frozen.
So,
I mean, even though that's a huge mistake, if it still has the question, you can't just look at it in isolation. You have to look at the technology compared to what would have happened without it. Would there have been more mistakes like that, right? So, of course, that's really unfortunate. Of course, we want to fix that mistake with the technology. But what would have happened if we relied? How many mistakes would there have been?
But what's interesting about that is that there's almost like a relativity to that, where when we have these highlight clips from the 60s and 70s, people kicking 10 shades of shit out of each other and all the rest of it, and the goals and the magnificent goals. But we look forward to watching the highlights of the complete mistakes and saying, "Can you believe that happened?" Especially if it's for your team. I feel like there's a legacy in the sport in which like mistakes are as much a part of football as yellow cards are and painting lines on the pitch. Like, if you don't have mistakes, you've not got football. Like, because that's what people talk about in pubs. It's simple as that. That's why people are allowed to have opinions. There's a real banality around football at the minute where the crowd are talking on social media. They're talking, and it's become obsessed with data. Do you know that we completed 67.4% of passes in the last match? We should have won. And so the idiocy, excuse me, Simon, I don't know if we're actually isolating people from listening to this podcast, but the idiocy from the crowds is actually turning into what they think is kind of like intellectual rigor. And it's kind of like turned into, we lost 4-0, but our keeper made 7 saves. Can you believe it? It's like, well, actually, the only thing that matters is how many goals you score and how many goals they don't score. So, I believe that for me, like, the reason why there's such a to-do about it is because mistakes. For me, I watch Match of the Day. I watch highlights because I want to see a foul that wasn't given that led to a goal that won. I want to see that. That's part of it. I don't want to see clean football. I don't want to see a practice match. I don't want to see training. I want to see incidents.
I mean, the interesting thing is that in the limit case, right, if we could account for everything and everything was known up front, there would be no point in playing. If we knew which team was better down to every, piece of atomic evidence, then we would just know that this team would win. Now, there's randomness that enters, right? So there's a wind gust that comes in, or the temperature rises, or there's a mistake by the officials or something like this. that makes the kind of outcome of play indeterminate. And of course, not knowing which team is actually better, right? But if we could eliminate all randomness and we knew exactly the skill levels of this team and that team, then without randomness, the better team would win. And that's just not interesting, because that removes the excitement of watching the play to see what happens, right? So in the case, it's no fun.
Do you think that there's a case in point that with any kind of like structure that's so centered around capitalist ends and the kind of power structures, even within football, there is a power structure that has to be maintained? There's almost like this kind of Marxist kind of like hierarchy of these billionaire clubs have to remain being billionaires, and this club that pays their players' wages at a tenth of the price as the rest of it has to stay rigid. It has to stay like that, because we're not talking about peanuts anymore. We're not talking about a few grand here and a few grand there. We're talking about billions, and I don't know how much the English Premiership's worth. Across the globe, it's probably worth trillions, right? In some respects, especially in terms of legacy and in terms of the future. When they're around the table bartering, if you forget COVID for a minute, they're going to be saying, okay, these Saudi Arabians that own this team are going to be spending this much money, and these Americans that own this team are going to be spending this much money, and this multi-millionaire Italian that owns this club, and all that money is just feeding this kind of almost pyramid scheme that is English football. Do you think that the technology and the kind of weight of decision can be in some way swayed by the need to keep that hierarchy?
I mean, these are incentives that might pull against each other, of course, right? I mean, if you need a team to win and the VAR says that the guy was offside, or the goal technology says that the goal was or wasn't scored, then of course that can pull against it, right? So there is some kind of objectivity here, which avoids corruption.
But the problem is that the objectivity is undermined by the fact that the super data-led VAR machines get it wrong.
Yeah, but they get it right more often than they get it wrong, and that's why they've been put into play, right? I mean, if they were more wrong, if they were less reliable than human judgment, then we wouldn't be using them. Yeah. So they're, in the grand scheme of things, more reliable, I think. And I think that's probably uncontroversial. It's the way that they change the game. Yeah. So the way that higher accuracy measurement changes the game. I don't find the goal scoring technology to be that controversial. You're pointing out a case where it made a mistake, but in the grand scheme of things, it's been very reliable. So I think that that's fine. It also doesn't interrupt the aesthetics or the flow of play. So I think that that's not such a big deal. Now, what's interesting, the way you guys are describing the VAR stuff, is that it changes the strategy. Yeah. It interrupts the flow of play, and it brings in, it's not exactly rules that weren't there, but a precision to the rules that people weren't really talking about. So reporters of both sides, you watch a video, a guy's arm, his elbow is offsides, right? But we would say that he's not offsides. And in a kind of sober moment, you and the supporter of the other club can agree that he's not offsides. But now that we have the technology to track and look more precisely at this, then there's a question of, well, how much of him has to be offside? How much of the person has to be offsides for this to count? Is it any atom of the person, or is it the majority of the atoms, or whatever? And that creates a whole new kind of a question, right? Whereas before we would have happily just let it go, I think. Yeah. And that's a negative thing.
I think for me, it begs the question about what football fans want to be, whether they actually want to be credulous or incredulous. And I still think VAR, I take on board what you're saying. It's right more often than it's wrong. But I think VAR is neutral. It's an application of a level of precision that we've not had before. And the reason it makes people uncomfortable is because actually maybe we've all been joining in with this lie that we can all tell ourselves that every decision that a linesman makes with offside, that a referee makes with handball, with a really dynamic foul that happens in a quick moment that the referee's got to make a split-second decision on, there's a credulity that we can lend our sort of tribe to, that we can say with some level of chance that we're right, that the referee's against us and he's made a decision against us because he doesn't like us, or just because that's the nature of what it means to support our club, or that actually, no, that was the right decision because it's benefited us, and for once the rules are being applied properly. And I think maybe there's something underneath that where actually football fans might need to realize they need to be comfortable with the fact that they quite like the mystery rather than the precision.
Well, I'm a credulous idiot. And so I just want my team to win. I don't care if it's right, wrong, or indifferent. So there's your answer. I don't care what the rules say.
There are other, well, you care to a certain degree. Otherwise, it's not the game. But there are other values than precision, right? So VAR probably wins on precision, but I've been saying it doesn't win on aesthetics. It might not win on how we like to talk about the game. It doesn't necessarily win on making a level playing field.
Well, one thing that's been really interesting this season, one thing that's been really interesting this season is the first time I've actually heard professionals that are commentating on football declaring it as entertainment. Like, and it's to do with the fact that there are some teams that are genuinely entertaining, like Leeds United being one of them, where you kind of think you flip a coin, they might win, they might lose, but it's fun. It's really fun. Yeah. And so that goes hand in hand with just like taking it as it comes. And, you know, there's an old adage in football that like one of the reasons why VAR is really unsuccessful is because there's a kind of thing where it evens itself out over a season. Like you might get a really crap handful of things thrown at you, but by the end of the season, you would have struck even with it in some way. But I've seen lots of commentators and lots of kind of like curators of the game say, listen, this is entertainment. And I think that COVID's done that because nothing else is going on. And so people are piled around their TV going, right, let's watch this, let's see what goes on. And it's the first time I've really looked at football like that. I've been willing to be bored to tears as long as we get 3 points. And I'm not prepared for that anymore. It's too much like, you know, PTSD, and I'm not willing to sit through that anymore. And so VAR seems like a complete antithesis to what that stands for. Like, it's not entertaining to see the game pulled apart like by 5 other individuals over a computer screen. That's not entertaining, you know.
I mean, there are ways of having your cake and eating it too, I think, as well. So in the US, when you go to the video referee in football, but in other sports as well, this costs a timeout. Yeah. And you don't have tons of timeouts. You don't have timeouts in football, but you do have substitutions.
Yeah.
Right.
We have we actually have a lot of time, and that's another way the game's adapted, and it feels really American. You know, it used to be you get to the last 2 minutes of the game and then you take the ball into the corner and you'd be fighting people off like this. So I think now that started at 15 minutes from the end of the game. You know, we're 1-0 up and we're going to stand in the corner and we're going to hope that someone comes and hacks your leg away, and then we'll kick the ball out. And people are wasting time for like 20% of the match. It's insidious.
Well, this is something that you could legislate with new regulations as well. But I'm just saying you could charge or take away a substitution with the use of VAR. So VAR basically wouldn't be in the game. It would be just officials' calls. But if there's just a completely missed call, it's definitely worth a substitution to go to VAR on that, right? And then in that case, it corrects the most egregious calls of the humans. And in those cases, we think, well, it would be good if it could fix it, right? But it costs the team something to implement it. So it's just not automatically going to VAR all the time. So you don't know if it's going to go to VAR because it depends on whether or not the other team or your team wants to force it to go in that direction by giving up a substitution. So in that case, that takes away some of the strategizing around the use of VAR. And it also helps the aesthetics, of course, because it's going to not interrupt the flow of the game. And it's not going to really tell in one way or the other with the credulity aspect, because you're going to only be calling this in when it's just obvious to everyone who just saw what happened that the guy was or wasn't offsides.
Mm-hmm.
And the VAR is just confirming what we as spectators already knew anyway, but the official clearly got wrong, rather than trying to give a more precise measurement about elbows, for example.
Yeah, sure.
I think that fits definitely a lot more of what most football fans would feel comfortable with. But again, like, I almost feel like the things that we speak about and the things that we talk about, the things that enter into our folklore, and the sort of the mythos of football are generally centered around injustice. So the hand of God. Even non-football fans know what the hand of God is, as this injustice. In the mythos of Leeds fans sing at the top of their voices, "We are the champions of Europe." We haven't been the champions of Europe. We should have been, but there was a match fixing scandal and some absolutely unjust calls from a referee in the game that we should have made us the champions of Europe. And so that's part of the mythos of Leeds. I'm sure every single club has that. There's, another thing that we'll be talking about for a long time, and it comes up every single clip show there is now, is the goal that went in when a beach ball somehow inexplicably made its way onto the pitch, and a ball ricocheted off the beach ball, went in, and the team won by a goal. And it's like, you're right, you can't legislate for a beach ball, but it's like, is there something about that actually says, why don't we just stop this messing around of these degrees of precision and sterilization in some ways, and actually just let's realize what we're all here for, which is for shared storytelling. And actually our most powerful stories, our mythos, for those of us that are interested and sort of captivated by football, is where injustice happens. I don't know.
I mean, but I don't think you want to encourage the injustice just to have the mythos around the club. So, and I think that if you had a soft touch VAR kind of solution, or something that a team had to pony up something for to use, I think that's a good compromise. Because, I mean, this still includes, like, it might, so imagine a situation where it's early in the match, is a bad call. You could use your substitution to call the VAR in, but you decide it doesn't matter. At this point, it's not worth it. I want to use these substitutions later on. These guys that I plan to substitute are tired because of previous matches. I have a strategy here. Turns out, later on, those guys are playing well, have a lot of stamina for some reason, don't need to use the substitutions, and had you challenged that, that would have made the difference in the game.
Yeah.
The match. Right? So, I mean, there's something to talk about here already. And it's a judgment call of a person, right? It's a coaching kind of situation. And you can still complain about what would have happened if your idiot manager had done something differently. And so I think the situations where VAR, I mean, in these cases, ideally, it would only come in those kinds of extreme injustice cases that we actually don't really want to be a part of the game. Yes, it's good to talk about them later on, but we wouldn't want to encourage them just to have something to talk about. If we did, why not pass out beach balls at every match just to see if one of them ends up on the pitch? Why not encourage people to streak occasionally across the match just to see what that does? We don't do this because we want to have a relatively level playing field for the teams when they go out there, right? And I think when something does happen, and other things will inevitably still happen, then that's something to talk about. But the VAR, when it has a light touch kind of a use, that would improve things, make things fairer, still give us something to bitch about later on in the pub, without necessarily ruining the game or being as intrusive as it is now.
Yeah. So when I told Sai that we were going to be talking to you, I said to him, can you think of any really interesting original themes that you want to talk about? And he said, I want to talk about COVID. He said, and I said, okay, fair enough. Well, I'm gonna dip out of that bit, and I'll just gonna have a bit of a lie down. but it's something we've kind of discussed philosophically. Si, do you want to broach that question about managers and players? Sorry, players.
Oh yeah.
Here we go.
I had
early onset dementia. I'm almost positive.
It's like, do I remember having this conversation? No, for me, something really interesting happened midway through lockdown 1, when all the graphs that we've been receiving, which show the exponential growth of cases, and there's that little dotted line that says prior to this, mass testing wasn't available. I'm fascinated by that, because prior to that dotted line where it says from this time on mass testing was available, for quite a period of time, our footballers were being tested regularly so that they could get back out and play football.
I think it's worth saying a lot of them came back as positive as well.
Yeah. So like the testing worked. I mean, you could argue that they were the guinea pigs. I don't think that was the thinking behind it. What I found interesting was that at the time, there wasn't mass testing for NHS members of staff. There wasn't mass testing for educators who were still providing face-to-face teaching for vulnerable children and key workers. But there was testing in a mass sense available for millionaire teenagers who played on a green square of grass every week. And I just wondered, kind of philosophically, what your thoughts are, what that raises with you, because for me, I felt like my head just blew up when I came to that realization, and every time I look at that graph, that's all I can think of, that at this time these elites were given the priority testing.
Yeah. So let me try to think about how that could ever be okay. So I mean, this is something that you do in philosophy sometimes. You try to be as charitable to your opponent as possible. And there is a charitable story to tell here. Whether it stands up, I'm not sure. It might be, so mass testing wasn't available. We only have a limited number of tests to give to people, right? And you've named NHS workers and teachers and footballers. Let's take these 3 groups. If the testing is intended to save the individuals who are being tested, to save their lives, right? Rather than finding out whether or not it's okay for them to go back to work. These are 2 different kinds of things. Football generates a lot of money. If it's true that it's most important financially, economically, for them to go back to work over teachers, let's say, and neither one is going to die because the teachers are relatively young and the footballers are relatively young. The testing isn't to save their lives. It's just to see if they're infected and if they're going to infect others, because they're going to be back into the kind of social sphere. Then it might not be so objectionable that basically what we want to do is we want to test those workers that we're going to put back out there socially, because they're going to be mixing around. And we test not those workers who we think are most vulnerable to dying from COVID, but those that we have the best economic case for putting back into society, circulating as workers. Now, even under that charitable interpretation, it's hard to see how NHS workers don't come out as more important than footballers. Partly because they're there to save other lives, but also because we do know that the greater exposure to viral loads that you have, the more likely that you have severe COVID and possibly die as well. So when younger people have died, in many cases, they have been healthcare workers because they've been exposed to very high viral loads. So this whole idea that testing is there to help the economy rather than save the life of the person being tested doesn't seem like it's necessarily true in the case of NHS workers, right? But this might be what people were thinking. maybe people were thinking that the most economically important sector was football, and that testing is there to see if it's safe for these people to circulate, but not necessarily to save their lives. That would have been then, I think, a mistake, because the NHS is a counterexample to that. Because it seems more economically, however you want to look at it, it seems more economically important right now. It also seems like it would have perhaps been saving NHS workers' lives. Teachers, you know, as you guys are teachers, I'm a teacher. The case could be made maybe along economic lines against us and in favor of the footballers, especially because we can still do what we do to a certain degree, although not as well, over the internet. It's easier as the students get older, of course, but you can't play a football match over the internet. And there's also something to be said for inspiring the troops, right? So, you know, if everyone can keep their morale up, then people can endure lockdown longer. If people can endure lockdown longer because they're able to watch matches, then that saves lives too.
Well, you know, I think, you know, there are issues around that, like domestic violence went through the roof when football was suspended full stop. And I'm not going to blame football. I think that's cultural, and there's something going on there to do with the relationship between alcohol and all that kind of stuff. Interesting. So, Simon,
for me, I guess it leads to one of the things that we've spent a lot of time looking at is how, in a lot of ways, Stu and I have come to the conclusion that football has replaced Christianity as the main religion in our country. Stu very eloquently puts it in terms of, you know, the poor people spending their paychecks lining up around the street once a week to enter into their churches to pay devotion to their the high priests
dressed in silly uniforms.
Dressed in silly uniforms, buying all the merchandise they can.
All fundamentally believing in the same thing, yet violently opposing each other.
Inculcating their
children
faith into their children, you know, all those sort of things. So what's really interesting is that you mentioned there about rallying the troops, and it's you know, I go back to the, you know, religion is the opiate of the masses.
Exactly, that's what I was going to say. Maybe football now. Yeah,
maybe that was part of it. That it's just, I think when history looks back on 2020, I think that little dotted line will become more and more important in some ways. I think it was an interesting delineation between the fact that it's testing, isn't it? So what you're testing is how ready this person is to go back into some level of society and social engagement. We're not talking about the footballers being given priority vaccines. I think that would have been an interesting, a different scandal in a different way. If somebody was saying, well, you know, got to get out, that one's not quite past muster. Let's keep the troops happy. Let's give all these 19-year-olds the vaccines, whilst 8-year-olds are still passing away in care homes, you know, through COVID. But yeah, for me, it raised a really interesting question over the haves and the have-nots in society in some ways, and actually, I think particularly when you have existential crises, of which COVID is one, it's a really useful measuring stick for gauging where society is at, actually, because the lowest common denominators hit. And so there was this incredible rush. We've got to get the professional sports back on going. And I think I was one of the people that was like, yeah, of course. And then afterwards, I sort of thought, wait a minute, but quite a lot of NHS staff have died. And quite a lot of other areas of society have been completely and utterly neglected. Yeah. Why is that? And it's a sort of, and maybe it is that was like the sort of the opiate of the masses.
But I mean, I do think that professional sport does something to keep people, I mean, rallying the troops, keeping your morale up. I do think that's important. How long do you think the first, second, or current lockdowns would last, or how do you think they would go if Netflix didn't exist? Or if broadband went out? Yeah. I mean, people would lose their minds.
Yeah.
Right? So, and you can say, like, I mean, giving to Netflix workers over teachers, yeah, I mean, that seems also egregious. But then you think, well, hold on. I mean, if that's keeping people indoors, then that can be important. So you have to kind of look at how these things function a little bit. But I do think that COVID really has laid bare where our interests lie and how where our priorities are. A friend of mine was talking about the US, and he said, Americans are obsessed with superhero movies and like being heroes and saving people's lives and stuff, but they have an opportunity now to save lives by not going out of their house. That's how you can be Captain America or whatever. You just have to sit inside and watch Netflix and buy yourself a PlayStation, and then you're not killing people. But they won't do that. They refuse to do that in the name of freedom or something like this. But they go out and they're the baddies. They don't realize it, but they're the baddies. They're the people who are killing people. So they're playing the wrong role in their own superhero movie, I think.
So just listening to your talk, obviously something like a global pandemic for a philosopher obviously has thrown up a few issues for you. And I don't just mean because scratching around trying to make a living. I mean, like coming to terms with like big ideas and things, I guess, that you are talking to your students about. And I guess it's kind of like quite invasive on your professional life right now. What do you make of the moral stances and the kind of global response to the pandemic in terms of how does it sit with you philosophically? Do you disgusted by it? Are you kind of, like you said a second ago, you trying to find the charitable interpretation of it, or how do you sit with it?
Well, I think one thing that it shows is what I just mentioned, that people are pretty self-interested.
You didn't need a pandemic for that though, did you?
No, but it really shows it, because they have a real chance to make a difference, right? So in lots of our lives, we don't have a chance to really do much of consequence. But in this case, you can really make a difference. And what this same friend of mine pointed out was that people are really reticent to stay inside. They're really reticent to wear masks in the US. But when it comes time to get a vaccine, they're trampling over the top of each other to get the vaccine, because that protects them. Right? The masks staying inside,
the masks are symbolic, aren't they? The masks are purely symbolic in that thing of, do you care about the people around you? Like, you don't wear a mask for yourself. I think what's interesting is...
they help yourself a little. I think they help the wearer slightly, but
yeah,
they're primarily for other people.
Do you find that this idea of altruism is more effective if you ask people to do something as opposed to nothing? Because that's what people are being asked to do.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting thing. So in philosophy, you have this action-omission distinction.
Right, okay.
And people tend to attach more weight to actions. So if it was push this button to save someone versus sit here to save someone, it's much easier to push the button to save someone.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's part of the psychology of it. But I don't think that necessarily changes the morality of it. I think one of the lessons to draw from the fact that people are less altruistic than some would have us believe is that we should design our institutions and society and regulations with this in mind. So we should try to use people's own interests to incentivize them to do things for the common good. And we shouldn't kid ourselves into thinking that people are going to behave in altruistic ways.
No.
We should try to give them incentives for themselves to behave in such ways. Of course, there are situations when the stakes are relatively low where people do behave quite altruistically. But when the stakes are high, like a global pandemic, that's pretty high, people are shits, I think.
Brilliant. And so listen, let's be honest, like, other people have just let us down terribly. What about the respective governments?
Well, I think it's quite interesting when you look at the number of infections in the US and where there's a curve, which is where the Biden administration comes in. Obviously, this curve actually represents the rollout of the vaccines and the end of winter to a certain degree. But of course, Trump was a travesty for the US based on the amount of healthcare that we have and the wealth that we have compared to the deaths that we have, the death rates and the infection rates. It's the worst in the world, really. The UK, I'm not a Boris fan, but I have to say they made mistakes in the beginning, especially by thinking that they might go for this kind of herd immunity strategy up front. And they've not had very clear messaging going through. So they've been inconsistent or confusing and changed the way that we kind of think about and understand the restrictions a number of times. But they've done a good job with vaccinations, and they've done a decent job before vaccines at controlling it, especially because they got off on the wrong foot in the beginning. So they did such a bad job in the beginning, but they kind of saw it back a little bit as they went through. So they've definitely done an amazing job on vaccine provisions. Done a decent job at catching up on their pretty bad blunder in the beginning. So I give the British government a C, I guess. The US gets an F. Yeah. And Europe has done a pretty damn good job. Obviously, like Italy got caught off guard in the beginning. And I think Spain to a certain extent as well, but they've recovered and did a very good job of controlling it. But they are flubbing the vaccine a little bit. And this idea that, I mean, this is pretty far from football now, but I think that the EU's response to the AstraZeneca vaccine is ridiculous and morally bankrupt. It's a kind of a political move. So when you look at the rates, the base rate of blood clotting in the general population compared to people who have had the vaccine, there's no difference.
No.
So it's like saying that the vaccine causes people to go to McDonald's because many people after getting the vaccine go to McDonald's. There's no causal evidence of the blood clotting. There's no greater incidence of blood clotting amongst people who have had the vaccine. So there's no reason to believe that it's in any way linked.
No.
And yet they've banded together to say that they're going to suspend AstraZeneca vaccinations. And that, I think, is really, and they say that they're doing this in order to help protect public perception around the safety of vaccines. Well, here's a way to protect public perception around the safety of vaccines. Don't start telling people about these blood clots when you have no evidence that they're causing any problems. And don't suspend the use when you have no evidence that there are any problems, right? That's what makes people skittish about it. Now people in Britain are worried about AstraZeneca when they have no reason to be. So that was a bad move, I think, on the EU's part when it comes to vaccinations. And it's a bad move to not use these vaccines that they have available to them. Even if it did cause the blood clots, you have to weigh these things against each other.
Of course,
I would take it even if I knew that it did cause blood clots in a low enough proportion of people. You know, if that cost is lower than the cost of getting COVID, then you should still take the vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely. As you just said, we've veered pretty wildly away from football. Simon, is there anything else you would like to ask Benjamin while we have him with us?
Yeah, I thought we've got 9 minutes, haven't we, before before Zoom cuts us off again. But I guess for me, like there's this big question in and around. It still sits with that sort of credulity thing, and the vaccines is case in point about that. Keyboard warriors, Google sort of experts who have somehow fallen foul of this sort of alternative truths and all of this sort of side thing. So it makes me worried, and it concerns me that the Dunning-Kruger effect is being just absolutely shown in terms of people with a very little bit of knowledge having absolute strength of conviction, whereas those who are a bit further down, who have more knowledge, who feel like actually there's so much I don't know.
You've just stripped Yeats of all of the poetry. Carry on.
That's excoriating. I guess in some ways it's looking at that. One of the things that I was thinking about, particularly around football and around decision making in football, is I kind of wanted to chat to you just a little bit about it's still around that sort of credulity and actually whether or not there's something philosophically attractive as a human being that we have that draws us to unanswerables. So we actually interviewed a statistical philosopher, this guy called Just, who he did not like what he described as continental philosophy.
No. I came in with all kinds of amazing
morality, and that's he very coldly sort of just said, I'm not interested in that at all. And that was a full stop for you for about half an hour.
He's a philosopher in Amsterdam, isn't it? The University of Amsterdam. His name's Joost van der Leesch.
Yeah,
and he's now an expert in kind of like data analysis and the philosophical slant on how you use data.
And yeah, it's led me to this point. Like, actually, I think our conversation, though it's taken us away from football, it's sort of football is part of this as well in terms of what we're talking about is this human condition. I've got this suspicion that actually there's something hugely attractive as a species, that we find mystery, and I think there are ways in which we sometimes almost subconsciously go for and find ways to distort clear facts, clear correlations, to almost exist in this foggy netherworld. And I don't know, that exists in football, that exists in vaccines, that exists. I just wonder if there's something that if that, where you sit on that and your sort of feelings around that.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a big question. It covers a lot of things, right? I think, when I was talking before about if we knew all of the facts with certainty about all of the teams and all the conditions under which they play, we know who would win, and there would be no point in playing the match, right? And so the uncertainty that we have because we don't know these things is what makes watching the match fun. And so we do like uncertainty. We are drawn to it a little bit, for sure. And sometimes we're drawn to it a lot. I mean, some of the things that attract people to religion is the mystery and the kind of enigma of religion. Other people are quite rational in their religion, actually. So you don't have to be drawn to mystery in order to be religious. But I think for many people, that's the core of the interest as well. I think that we can't ever answer all the questions that we have. There are certain things that we can't know. There are certain mysteries that will always remain. And so, I'm sure Joost as a statistical philosopher knows that there are unanswerable questions even in mathematics.
What did he say about, he said something about, he's a big fan of probability. And he said, basically, probability clears up all life's problems. Is there a God? Probably not.
Yeah, he uses the term prevision. So rather than talking about predicting the future, he used the term prevision. So using probability to say, particularly normal distributions in a lot of ways, say actually there's a very high degree chance that this will be the outcome. Therefore, this is what we base our thinking on.
I think with a lot of social issues, that makes a lot of sense. I think that when we're trying to socially plan societies, when we're trying to make ethical decisions, we have a lot of information that we can and should use to make these decisions. It doesn't mean that the world is fundamentally deterministic at the most basic level. We know from quantum mechanics that the world is probably indeterministic at the most basic level. So there is some randomness there. How that translates into how we live our own lives, how it translates from the kind of quantum level to the macro level is a complicated question that physicists and philosophers are working on now. It's not clear that randomness at that fundamental level would do something like preserve free will or anything like this. It could just be that our choices are made randomly, which isn't any better than if they're determined, right? So, yeah, I think that at the level of ethics and social planning, we do have a lot of information we should take into account, but the world is far from deterministic. And I think philosophically, there are always going to be questions that we can raise and that we can ask.
And is this the? I think of football in particular. Is it the playground of the apex predator? in that we're not being hunted. We're not being, we're not, our gene isn't at risk of becoming extinct unless we do it ourselves. And so actually, have we got the freedom to be able to explore mystery?
I think so. I mean, it's a form of play, really. It's a form of play of societies that are doing well. And that's what VAR ruins in many ways, is that mystery. We don't, and I mean, when I was talking about the practical solution to VAR, what's interesting about that solution is that doesn't do anything to the mystery. Because if everyone saw that the guy is offside, and then you use your substitution to pull in the VAR to confirm what everyone knows, there's no loss of mystery there. Everyone already knew it. But when it's so close that you can't see it and you don't want to use that substitution because you don't think that that's worth it, now there's still the mystery there.
Ben, you've got to get to the patent office tomorrow because I'm pretty certain you've actually just solved the biggest debate in football at the moment.
Yeah.
Because I can't find a flaw in what you're saying here. Actually,
it's the tennis thing. It's what they introduced in tennis, isn't it? Is that right? Where you kind of have a certain amount of, I'm going to debate that. And
I mean, it's the same. You have
lose, that's it. It's gone.
Yeah.
Get yourself down the patent office. Maybe that was a 1990s thing. I don't know if the patent office still exists.
Right. Benjamin, I would like to say to you, despite my seemingly disparaging remarks about your weight at the beginning of this podcast, I don't mean any of it, and you're definitely the best looking philosopher we know. And we know more philosophers.
One of the few.
So it's been an absolute delight to speak to you. I would like it if we could speak to you relatively regularly, although I understand you're trying to hold down a serious relationship, so that might not be able to be done. But I will harass and harangue you in the future about just coming on and talking about this stuff, because I think it's important that we're talking about football, but one of the things that excites us about philosophy is that it does reach out into the wider understanding of what goes on in the world. And it's been amazing to talk to you. It's been amazing to see you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm happy to come back whenever. It's always,
see you tomorrow.
A pleasure.
Fantastic. Okay. Until we see you next time, farewell.
All right.
Thank you very much,
guys.
It's great to chat to you.
Cheers.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.